Hello, welcome to another Bible Made Easy video with Stephen Craig. This is my second video. I made our first video yesterday when we looked at a teaching tool that I was introduced to back in the 1970s. It was my Old Testament timeline. And actually, when I looked at that video, I made two mistakes, but I didn't want to remake the whole video. But we looked at the video from, of course, the Garden of Eden to the end of the Old Testament period. And one of the mistakes I made is when I was talking about the Northern Kingdom. At one point I said there were 19 different dynasties. That's wrong. The Northern and Southern Kingdom each had 19 different kings, but in the Northern Kingdom had 9 different dynasties. That is, not 19. And then another mistake I made was during talking about the prophets and the books of the Old Testament. I said there were 5 major prophets and 5 minor prophets. Well, actually there's 12 minor prophets. So I'm sure that as I make these videos, I will make a mistake from time to time, but that just helps keep you on your toes. But as I introduced the Old Testament timeline to you yesterday, we talked about how that in Genesis, the first 11 chapters talk about the history of the world. That is before the Bible changes its focus in Genesis 12 with the call of Abraham. So what we want to do today is to look at these first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. And I have a shortened version of the timeline to illustrate what we're going to be talking about. You see, of course, the Garden of Eden, sin entering the world, of course, the world becoming sinful, and then the flood, and of course Noah's family and the Tower of Babel. So we go through the book of Genesis. The first 2 chapters talk about creation. So we see the laws established to govern this material world in the universe. And an important thing, a concept is introduced in chapter 1, and that is that God said in creation things will reproduce after their kind. Then in chapters 3 and 4, he deals with the fall of man, of course with Adam and Eve and then Cain and Abel. In chapter 5, we see how the world began to be populated through the descendants of Adam and Eve. In chapters 6 and 7, we have the story of the flood. We're told about the sinful world, about Noah being found perfect in his generation, and of course in the ark and the actual flood. In Genesis 9 and 10, we see the family of Noah, how through his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, that the world was once again repopulated. And then in Genesis chapter 11, we have the Tower of Babel. It is where the descendants of Noah were together and were one people and one language. Now, I usually try to be very factual and definite when I'm teaching my Bible classes, but that's kind of hard to do when you're dealing with these very early events, because there's some controversy and there's a lot of different opinions of what happened, and unfortunately it comes down to just that I can offer up my opinion or how I feel about some things, but these are things that really can't be proven, but in the long run it's not something that's necessary for salvation. But I did make the point yesterday when I introduced you to my Old Testament timeline. I had said that as we get closer to the time of Christ, it's easier to be more accurate with dates and things because things in the Bible correspond with other world events. But as we go back in this early time, it's really hard to be accurate, and because there are such differences of opinion. And of course, the biggest difference is whether the world came by chance and man evolved through evolution, or there's actually a creation. And I said at the beginning of my video yesterday that I'm making these videos for people who believe in God and for people who believe that the Bible is the inspired Word of God. Now, it's pretty hard to convince people if they don't believe in God or don't believe in the Bible that these events recorded in the early chapters of Genesis are true. There's another man that I've listened to quite a bit on the YouTube channel. His name is Dr. Grady McMurtry. That's Dr. Grady McMurtry. And he's a very well-educated man. I know he has at least 2 PhDs, but he's a Christian who believes in the young earth, that the earth is not millions of years old, but only a few thousand years old. And so I would direct you to some of his videos. He has some very excellent videos to establish the young age of the earth, and some great proofs in the flood and some of the other things that we see here in these early chapters of Genesis. But that's what it really comes down to, that it is we either believe in Charles Darwin or we believe in Gregor Mendel. Of course, we know Charles Darwin is the one who wrote the book Origin of Species and really promoted the idea of evolution. It's interesting that before the time of Darwin in the later 1800s, the country pretty much believed in God and the creation story, and even in the young earth. Encyclopedia Britannica, even back in the 1700s, gives a young age for the earth. But of course, after Darwin and the rise of universities, we see a shift and people trying to rewrite history and especially ignore much of the evidence it exists in the world for the truth of the creation story. And the reason I mentioned the name Gregor Mendel, he was an Austrian monk that lived about the same time as Darwin, and he's the one that experimented with guinea pigs, and he proved what we read in Genesis 1, and that is that things reproduce after their kind. You know, he had a white guinea pig and a black guinea pig, and he would breed them together, and he would determine that they would reproduce, you know, multicolored sometimes guinea pig, but ultimately they did do just like the Bible said, and that is that they reproduced after their kind. So believing in creation or evolution really comes down to you, whether you want to believe that after millions and millions of years that, man evolved from the sea and turned into a fish and turned into a monkey and turned into a man, or you can believe the foolish thing, that is that we actually had a creator. And of course, and it's the same way with the age of the earth. You can either believe that it is millions and millions of years, or you can look at the evidence. But there's really evidence in the world that there was a biblical flood, and that even that man and dinosaurs existed at the same time. I like this photo I've used a lot. This is from a book called The Genesis Flood. And these pictures were taken from the Biloxi Riverbed in Texas. And of course it shows the giant footprints of men, and of course the idea of men and dinosaurs living together. And this is something too that the Bible supports, because in the book of Job, it actually talks about two creatures there, a behemoth and a leviathan. And when you read those chapters in the book of Job, chapter 40 and 41, you'll see that it's a clear description of dinosaurs. And when God mentions that, he says, "Have you seen the behemoth which I made along with you?" Showing again that men and dinosaurs did exist at the same time. Of course, another great controversy of these early chapters of Genesis are the idea of giants. Of course, there's an interesting passage in Genesis chapter 6 when it says that the sons of God saw daughters of men that they were fair, and took them wives, all whom they chose. And then it talks about their offspring being giants. And so, is this really saying that angels married human women and had these giants? Well, I've been in religious classes, where the professors or teachers will just reject that as total foolishness. But I tend to believe that that's exactly the case. And I do so because throughout the Bible, like in the book of Job, or when it refers to the sons of God coming to present themselves before the Lord, it's clearly talking about angels. And then there's an interesting passage in the New Testament in Jude verse 6, when it says, "The angels that sinned, that did not keep their proper domain, that God has reserved for judgment." So what is the proper domain of angels? Well, of course, it's the heavenly realm. And so I think that the Bible, in this way, teaches that exactly what happened, that angels came down and did intermarry with human women before the flood. And also this would correspond with what we see throughout mythology, because all the Greek and Roman mythology has this idea of the gods, that is, coming down intermarrying with women. So I tend to think that that's true. And then what's interesting is we do also know that giants did exist after the flood. So obviously the descendants of Noah carried the genetics, the genes in their body to produce giants. Throughout in the book of Genesis, chapter 14, we read a story of kings, where the kings from Mesopotamia area came to fight against the giants that lived in the Canaan land. When the children of Israel, of course, were coming out of Egypt, going into the land of Canaan, they described the inhabitants as being giants. They said we were like grasshoppers in our own sight. And we have other references to giants throughout the book of Deuteronomy. And of course, we know that giants existed even up to the time of David. Of course, the most famous giant being Goliath. And then, interesting, in the book of 2 Samuel 21, we list other giants there, one being the brother of Goliath, but it even talks about one of the giants having 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes. And what's remarkable about that is, again, you can find much of this on YouTube videos about how there is much evidence in the world that giants did exist, even in the Americas here, in Europe, Asia, really throughout the world. And we see just what is portrayed in the Bible, that these giants did exist at the same time as man, but that, as in the biblical cases, that many times the men were able to kill these giants. And like I said, I find some of the most fascinating, some of that among the American Indians, some legends of the Mississippian people. And there's quite a mention of giants, and of course there were much evidence for giants. But of course, as the rise and the theories of evolution and all that grew in the late 18 and early 1900s, again, much of the evidence for these types of things began to mysteriously disappear. But some of the other interesting things that are mentioned in these early chapters of Genesis are the ideal of surgery. I always find that fascinating, because up to Civil War time, they were still sawing people's legs off while they were awake. So surgery is something relatively modern. Yet in the book of Genesis, it said that God caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam. He opened his side, took one of his ribs, and closed up the flesh in his place. Perfect description of surgery. There's a lot of discussion about where did Cain get his wife. Well, that's answered also in Genesis 3, verse 20, because it said that Adam called the name of his wife Eve because she was the mother of all living. And it's interesting that no laws were given against incest until thousands of years later, at the time of the Exodus, is when we see the first laws against incest. We had the first prayer mentioned in Genesis 4, verse 26. It said that's when men began to call upon the name of the Lord. We have global warming disputed after the flood, when God placed the rainbow and said he would never again destroy the world by flood. He made a promise. He said that as long as the earth stands, summer and winter, cold and heat, seed time and harvest shall not cease. So there may be many scientists who believe in global warming, but for me, I'll just believe the Bible. We have the introduction to the death penalty in Genesis 9, where he said, whosoever sheds man's blood, by him his blood shall be shed, by man shall his blood be shed. And then we see the beginning of a kingdom in chapter 10, at the time of Nimrod. It said then Nimrod began to be a mighty hunter in the earth, and the beginning of his kingdom was there, of course, Nineveh. But one of the most interesting things is, of course, the Tower of Babel. That's when we mentioned that the people were one and had one language, but because they tried to glorify themselves instead of God, God confused the language and scattered the people. And so that was the beginning of nationalities as we know it. And I think that's the only danger that we have in modern time, is that we get back to the Tower of Babel. That is where we try to glorify ourselves instead of glorify God. But I see the Tower of Babel as a simple explanation for the existence of the different nations and nationalities that we have in the world today. I hope this video has been interesting to you, and I hope to see you again.